I'm an economist, and we are called the dismal science. So I'm going to use some slides. And the reason I get away with it is because my book, I have a blessing from Professor Lampton who wrote a review on it. Otherwise, it never would have been published. I want to give you a context about what's happening in the economy. It's a backdrop to the issues that Ambassador Roy and Professor Sutter are going to talk about in terms of the politics and foreign relations. The point I want to make, actually, is when you talk about U.S. China relations and how difficult it is, it's difficult because our understandings of what's going on, in my book, I say is always wrong. And if it's wrong, then the recommendations are going to be wrong. And I look at this from an economist viewpoint. So let me illustrate what I mean by the analysis is always wrong. What is it that the Party Congress was facing when it gathered in last week? Overseas, negative global perceptions about China, driven by trade and investment tensions with the West. At home, a deteriorating debt situation, a growth slowdown that's been going on for years, a major corruption campaign, pressures for systemic reforms, both economic and political. Now, if our analysis of these problems is wrong, then the recommendations are likely to be wrong. So let us go back and ask, what is it that is driving these tensions and beliefs, particularly from an American viewpoint, since we're sitting here in Washington? And the first point I'd like to say is, what do Americans think about China? And the question is, who is the world's leading economic power? So Gallup and Pew every year ask Americans, who is the world's leading economic power? 10 years ago, the answer was very clear. America, by far, was the leading economic power. Only 10% said China. And then you see the change over time. And then you see the global financial crisis where it switches. Today, the majority of Americans will say China is the world's leading economic power. If you ask the Chinese the same question, who is the world's leading economic power? The vast majority of the Chinese will say America is. So here's a strange situation. Americans think China is leading economic power. The Chinese think America is the leading economic power. Usually we think the most of ourselves, right? But now we have the opposite. Who's right? China's right. America is the world's leading economic power by far. And the interesting thing is if you ask this globally to all the rest of the world, South Asia, East Asia, Africa, Latin America, Europe, who is the world's leading economic power? Every other region of the world will say America is the leading economic power, except for one region. And when I ask what is that region, people will say maybe it's Africa, because China's dominant there, or East Asia's neighbors. Wrong, wrong, wrong. None of those. It's Europe. So you have the strange situation that Europe and America think China's leading economic power, but everybody else thinks America is. And here in this particular case, the rest of the world is right, but America and Europe are wrong. So why do they think this? And why does this matter? Because this drives a degree of insecurity and tension. So this is a map of Americans' perceptions of China. It's more personal. The question is, do you like or dislike China? Because this shapes public policy. And you can see that the curve becomes 10, 15 years ago, which extremely positive because down is good, up is bad. It's hard to believe that 10 years ago, the vast majority of Americans had a positive view of China. And even as recently as 7 years ago, the vast majority of the Americans had a positive view of China. And then it switches. Now it's quite negative. And in my book, I trace this to economic issues. But then I say these economic issues shape our foreign policies and politics. And let's ask, what is the major issue, that economic issue that does this? And it's trade. So you ask the average American, who is responsible for America's trade deficits? And they will say China. China generates huge surpluses. So in my book, I basically say there's actually no link between America's trade deficits and China's huge surpluses. So how do I explain this to you? Because most of you are not economists. And I'll explain it to you in a very simple diagram. This is a diagram of America's trade deficits, the black line. And the top line, the red line, is China's trade surpluses. And if you look at it very carefully, America's deficits, insignificant in the late 90s, then they become really big, really huge by 2006, and then they start to moderate. Then look at China's trade surpluses. They're essentially non-existent until around 2004 or 5. Then they get very big, and then they come down. America's trade balances and China's trade balances move totally in the wrong direction if they were actually linked. They're not linked at all. But everyone in America thinks they are linked. That's my first point. This drives perceptions. This drives concepts of who's leading economic power, but it's actually based upon a false understanding. Now, what is the second issue that Americans think about when they think about China? And they think about foreign investment, all that money going overseas. You ask the average American, how much of America's foreign investment goes to China? And this leads to job loss. This leads to loss of competitiveness. And so the issue would be too much. So the White House says, we invest too much overseas, too much goes over to China, please bring it back, we need it here. So what percent of America's foreign investment goes to China? How do I know it's big? Now, if you look at Japan, Taiwan, South Korea, 10 to 20% of their foreign investment goes to China. That's big. So America's number's got to be smaller. So how much smaller is it? And when you ask foreign policy experts, they always get it wrong, because that number is only 1.5%. Only 1.5% of America's foreign investment goes to China. And the question now is quite different. It's no longer too much goes to China. The question is why so little goes to China. And in my book, I explain this by the composition of trade. And since we get the diagnosis wrong, we get the policy recommendation wrong. It's not about trade. There is something about foreign investment, but the issue is quite different. It's about how do I get more of America's foreign investment in China rather than worrying about too much is going over. This is the pattern, for example, of America's foreign investment going to China and Europe's. And you can see that 15 years ago, Europe and America invested the same amount, the same size economically and in trade, and then they diverge. America is constantly going down, Europe is constantly going up, and there's actually logic in why this is the case. But if we don't understand this logic, we then cannot ask the question, what should be our policies toward China in terms of foreign investment? And our answer is, there's a lot of win-win possible solutions, but because we don't get the problem correctly, we basically focus on the win-lose ones. Let's look at the third issue that I think is a big economic concern. The issue is China's becoming technologically much more innovative. It wants to produce more high-value products. It has the Made in China 2025 initiative. It is trying extremely hard. So this diagram I plot on the horizontal axis per capita GDP, the wealth of a country, and the vertical axis is how hard they try to become innovative. So first of all, you notice the line is linear, upward sloping, and most countries are very close to the line. The fit is extremely close. The richer you are, the more effort you make to become innovative. And the distance from the line, the vertical distance, is when you're trying harder than would be normal for your income level. And you see that China's distance is the largest. It tries harder than any country we've seen to become more innovative. In the last 15, 20 years, the only other country that has exhibited this amount of effort is South Korea. So the question is it actually getting results out of this? And it's too hard to go into this discussion here, but the answer is, in terms of outcomes, it's actually quite normal. But that normal is split up between services, where it's abnormally low, and manufacturing, where it's abnormally high. And this creates, again, a source of tension that needs to be addressed. Why is China relatively successful, however, in getting foreign technology and moving up the value chain? And this is a line that shows how successful a country is in copying, getting, importing, buying foreign technology from overseas and being able to use it at home in a profitable way. And you can see that China is in a class by itself. It is really good at this. And this is the reason why it grows at 10% a year. The factors that determine whether a country can actually do this, borrow technology from others, use it efficiently at home, not as well researched, but it's the key reason why China is so successful. But China gets this mostly from foreign investment, from trade, from buying patents, from reverse engineering, but it also gets it from stealing. Okay? So this is a diagram which is, I don't think it's ever been produced. It's the likelihood that you will steal and you will be censored for it. And this is the 301 law that you read in the newspapers. Every year the U.S. comes out with a report, And countries which are seen as stealing or unfair get censured. And if you're censured really severely, you're in red. And if it's slightly censured, you're in pink. If you're in green, you're no longer censured. Now, where this diagram compares China with Korea, Japan, Taiwan historically, and the thing we find very interesting is all low-income, successful countries stole. Okay? It turns out that the low-income countries which don't grow very, very rapidly, they don't steal. So stealing is actually a characteristic of a very successful country. The other interesting thing about this, every country stops stealing at the same income level. Okay? And this is a big issue because there's going to be a tremendous amount of debate about is China stealing, how much, how do you address it, and actually economics can explain this question. Is China going to grow very rapidly? The Party Congress statement avoided talking about growth rates for the first time, which is a sensible thing. The optimists see a growth rate of 6 to 7% for the foreseeable future. The pessimists see a collapse coming. There's the red line called likely. That's me. I call myself likely here. And I see a gradual decline, but it's not going to be as good as the optimist, but not as steep as the pessimist. If you are a pessimist, you're likely to believe that China has a financial problem, a debt crisis. You see a lot of articles about debt crisis. So does China have a debt crisis? In my book, I actually say China does not have a debt crisis, but most everyone else says it does have a debt crisis. So how do I make the argument that China does not have a debt crisis? This is a graph of China's debt to GDP ratio measured against the 100 largest economies on the horizontal line. And you can see where China ranks, around 250, 60% debt to GDP ratio. And the interesting thing is its debt to GDP ratio is right in the middle. Higher than most developing, lower than most developed. Now, if you ask the question, is China a developing country or a developed country? The answer is probably neither, actually. It's not really a developing, it's not really developed. If I had to guess, I would guess it'd be right in the middle, and it's exactly in the middle. The problem, however, is the increase of the ratio over the last 10 or 15 years, and that's the vertical axis, and you can see that China is in a class by itself. Most countries where the debt ratios soar that rapidly have crashed. All but one country, Singapore. Singapore's debt increases are even higher. Its ratio is higher. The interesting thing is that China's debt situation most resembles Singapore's, but practically no one ever compares the two because they always compare China to Japan or the United States or England or Spain. So what is really unique about China, and the really unique thing is that so much of its credit went into property. So property prices in Beijing, Shanghai went up 600%. Here in the United States, when it's 100% or 200%, we think we have a bubble. So why is a 600% increase in China not a bubble? And the answer, of course, is there's no private property 10 years ago, 15 years ago. So you're going from very low levels to something very, very high. So I have a completely different indicator about debt problems in China. Two measurements. The red one is the traditional, debt to GDP. That's been soaring. That makes people worry a lot about China having a debt problem. The blue line is debt to the value of your assets. And the value of assets in China is soaring. That line is negatively sloped. Now, if you are a company, and the blue line is what's happening in your company, your share prices are soaring. You're getting fabulously wealthy. So in my book, I call this process not a debt crisis, but financial deepening. And if you don't understand the natures of that, it's hard to solve. Now, I don't see debt as the issue, but I do see these as the issue. One is the state enterprises. Their rates of return has declined. They stayed very low. This has not been addressed. The Party Congress statements talk about the need to do this, but they're still waffling a lot. People like Nick Lardy write a lot about this issue. I don't think it's been tackled. This is one of the major contradictions. The major contradiction in this case being party statements saying that the market will be decisive in allocating resources, but in the same paragraph saying the state will be the dominant in the economy. You cannot resolve this without dealing with this kind of a question. But the real problem that gets very little recognition in China is the budget problem. Is the localities are borrowing. Localities are not allowed to borrow, but they create a fictitious SOE called the Local Investment Company. It borrows on behalf of the province. And it's able to do so because it uses provincially owned land as collateral, and it gets money from banks, from financial intermediaries, and then as local governments go, they produce infrastructure and property. This is the source of excessive land development, of ghost towns, of debt soaring, of shadow banking emerging. And the reason this is a problem is because it's not actually a banking problem, it's a budget problem. And this budget problem has not been solved in China. But if you don't solve this budget problem, then this issue of hemorrhaging, the financial system hemorrhaging in China, will continue. And this doesn't get very much attention, although the government realizes they have a problem here. The last issue I want to talk about is corruption, because this is President Xi Jinping's main initiative. What is the analytical issue here? The analytical issue here is we all write that the more corrupt a country, the slower it grows. Corruption is bad for growth. We also write that as a country gets richer, the less corrupt it becomes. So the United States and Europe, they're less corrupt than developing countries because it's richer. And here's the problem. Why is China different? A very corrupt country grows very rapidly. The richer it gets, the more corrupt it is. It defies the norms of what I call conventional wisdom. And the answer is, it has to be a reason that is unique to China but not to any other country. Because the standard rebuttal is, well, corruption doesn't retard growth in China because it greases the system. And the answer is, why does it grease the system now but didn't grease the system earlier? Why does it grease the system in China but not in India or Indonesia or Ukraine or the Middle East? What's unique about China about greasing the system? Some people say it's because, well, these are Chinese fooling around. And I say, well, they've always been Chinese. That can't explain the reason. And the reason is very simple. This is a mixed economy. The state owns all the resources, but the state cannot get high returns from the resources. The private sector can get high returns, but it doesn't own the resources. So corruption is a means of transferring the use rights of resources owned by the state to the private sector when you don't have the rule of law, when you have weak institutions. It's an incredibly effective instrument for growth and development, and China has made the best out of it. So when people ask me, what is the challenge for China? What is the growth model? What's the problem that everyone's facing? And Ambassador Roy referred to this in terms of the choice that the government has or has not made. So I illustrate this in one diagram. It's a dining table. And the top is a Chinese dining table. Chinese dining table has a round top, and the top is GDP. And it has one pillar in the center. That's the party, the government, SOE, state banks. They're all fused together. Corruption is the glue that fuses it together. This is an extremely efficient growth model. It's well integrated, coordinated, very good. And the bottom, the second, is a Western dining table. The Western dining table has 4 legs. It's sturdier. GDP is the top. But you have to have the party, the government, enterprises, the banks split. You have to have accountability, transparency. This is the pressure, because it also yields pressures for political change. This is the big choice that the party, Congress, or Chinese leaders have not actually faced up to and resolved. Which direction do they want to move to? Thank you very much.